fans, welcome to the Working Fans Podcast. We are celebrating episode 200 this weekend, and we have a major guest for you. Author Brian Solomon is back. Last time we had him on, we talked about Blood and Fire. And Brian, how did you like the reaction to the Sheik book? And you've been doing some promo work going out to Michigan. How has that all been since the book has come out?
Well, the reaction's been bigger than I ever possibly imagined. I mean, it was I was very hesitant to. I'm wondering, is this book even going to find an audience? Because it was a labor of love for me. And even when I reached out to Dave Drayson, who's one of the main voices in the book, the first thing he said to me was like, "How many people you think are going to buy this book? Like, why are you writing this book?" And it turned out to be, and I think it's because I never shut up about it. It turned out to be a huge success, bigger than I ever could have thought. I mean, it won the 2022 Wrestling Observer Award Book of the Year, which I can't think of a higher award for a wrestling book in particular. It got it's a Publisher's Weekly starred review, and like you were saying, the Library of Michigan recognized it because, of course, the Sheik was from Michigan as a 2022 notable book of the year. And so I got a chance to go out there. I brought my daughter with me. I hadn't been to Michigan certainly since I wrote the book because of COVID. I didn't, when I was writing it, travel was so limited. And so I had a chance to go there, and I got the award. And then I went back and did a whole library tour, like you said, across the state of Michigan. I mean, I was everywhere. I did I clustered them all together into 1 week so I wouldn't have to keep flying over and over again. Although I'm open to going back again, but I'm trying to keep it as economical as I can. But I mean, it's humbling. It's crazy when you go to these things. It's the same experience I had when I was working on WWE magazine back in the day, which is like you're in a little cubicle or your office or whatever, and it's so easy to forget people are reading this. Like a lot of people read it, they enjoy it, they want to talk about it. So it's like you get out of that bubble, and it can be really humbling and gratifying to see like how well liked the book has been, and it'll be a tough act to follow.
Now, at what point after the Sheik book did you decide to start the book that just came out, Superheroes, a pop culture phenomenon from Ant-Man to Zorro? Almost had the title memorized there.
Better than me.
And when did you, obviously you like talking about wrestling, so was this a chance to get to talk about something besides wrestling for once?
Yes, definitely. And I did another non-wrestling book a few years ago, Godzilla FAQ. And, I like to get outside of it now and then, even though wrestling's my thing. But the interesting thing is, the crazy thing is, those books really overlapped to a degree that I didn't even really plan, because I had done Godzilla FAQ, I think was the last book that I did. And I'm thinking like, hey, you know what? I got some time now. I want to try and pitch a new book. And I pitched the Superheroes book first, because that was the same company that did my Godzilla book and my Pro Wrestling FAQ book. I pitched them. I didn't hear anything back. Weeks went by. I gave up. And then I went to ECW Press and I said, okay, I'll try something wrestling related. I've never done a biography. And, I settled on the Sheik as my idea. I pitched them. They accepted it. And then I started working, and about a month later, the other company got back to me about Superheroes. And I was like, whoa, hold on. Okay, we got to plan this out. And I had to sort of stretch it out a little bit, so that I started writing the manuscript for Superheroes almost immediately after I finished writing the manuscript for Sheik, Blood and Fire. So what happened was, while we're doing the post work on the Sheik book, laying it out, getting photography, approving all the different stages, I'm there writing Superheroes at the same time. So it's not the ideal way, but I mean, in a way, it's nice when they both come out and now they're out there, within a year of each other. And, it's kind of nice. It was hell to get through. And I probably wouldn't have done it that way on purpose. But the crazy thing now is I'm trying to make sure that the Superheroes book doesn't kind of get lost in the shuffle a little bit, because I'm mostly known for the wrestling projects, and now I have my next wrestling project that I'm now starting. So I'm trying to make sure that it doesn't get forgotten. It's not as glamorous of a concept. I'm doing a great job of selling it, right? I mean, it's not personality driven. That's the thing. And I've always found that the books like the Sheik book, it's personality driven. So, and this one is the superheroes book is a reference book. It's a single volume, everything you ever want to know about the history of not just comic books, but of just the whole idea of superheroes and superhero fiction. And so, I feel like that book needs, in a way, it needs less work to sell because it's one of those books. If you're interested in the subject, you're going to want to buy it. It doesn't even matter who wrote it. It's like doesn't even matter if they know who I am. Like the concept sells the book.
Dave is big into superheroes, so he definitely wanted to ask a few questions about this.
I got some questions. I'm very interested. So I kind of like, I mean, I grew up on, like, this is kind of funny. I don't know, like me and Brian, I think we talked about some similar things in wrestling. So I'm wondering if it's similar. Like I grew up on the Bill Bixby, like Incredible Hulk, the reruns of Adam West Batman, like that's stuff. And then after the Christian Bale Batman movies, I think I took a little break from superheroes for a while, and then Marvel started really, I thought, painting this great story together, with all these different movies. Before I knew it, I started following all the movies since the Iron Man with Robert Downey Jr. I started watching all these Marvel movies, and I realized that, this is very similar to pro wrestling. I started drawing that comparison, like the storylines and what a fantastic job Marvel did of getting over certain characters, like throw an example, Doctor Strange, like he's got this backstory, but then you see him like in Avengers and he's a big deal there, like getting the main event rub, right? Like I started drawing all these analogies and stuff too. And that was kind of how I got into this. So I just want to start off. I don't know what is like, were you big into comic books? Like what are your, what were your favorite superheroes?
Yeah, I was a big collector. I mean, my prime era of collecting, even though there's been other points in my life where I got back into it, but I was a big comic book reader from like the mid 80s into the early 90s. And then I started, like having girlfriends and things like that. But I mean, those earlier years where you got so much time and you're young and, I would go to even before I discovered comic book stores, I would go to the newsstand we had around the corner every week and pick up, like I remember back then I had like a $5 bill, and this was when comics were 65, 75 cents, and I'd buy as many as I could get for $5. And then, I wound up bumping it up to $10 and all that. But I mean, I was a big, I started following comics around the time of what they now call kind of like the beginning of like the end of the Bronze Age, the beginning of the modern age in a way, like right after Crisis on Infinite Earths in DC, where they're rebooting all their characters for the first time. And right around the time of in between Secret Wars 1 and Secret Wars 2 with Marvel. Like that was like I remember one of the first books I ever bought was one of the original Secret Wars, which is, I know a lot of comic book purists, they hate Secret Wars, but if you're 9, 10 years old in 1984, 85, it is the greatest thing ever, where you've got every superhero, Marvel superhero, every Marvel supervillain, they're whisked away to this planet, and it's like this all-powerful being saying, okay, now fight each other. I mean, it's like the greatest idea ever. So that's what got me into comics and really interested in comics. The first, that was the beginning of it for me.
Okay. Now, do you have a preference of DC or Marvel, or does it just depend on the story? Or
I was way into Marvel over DC for really in the 80s and 90s, which was my heyday of comics collecting. I was way more of a Marvel fan. In fact, the only DC that I regularly enjoyed was Batman and Superman, the two big characters. And again, that was because, and Dave, I know you remember this, back in those ancient days when it came to movies, that's all you got. That was it. There was Batman movies and there was Superman movies. And so like, that's what I read. I wasn't into the wider DC universe. That changed in the early 2000s. By that point, I wasn't collecting as heavily as usual. It would take, I was married, I had kids, I had a job, a career. So it would take really special things to pull me back in. And that's the era when DC started doing these really interesting things. They were doing like Identity Crisis. They did the original 52. There was a lot of like, they were trying to like tie their continuity together in really interesting ways. They were getting a lot of great artists in. That's when they were doing They did All-Star Superman with Frank Quitely, which is like one of the greatest Superman stories ever. Things like that were bringing me into DC in a broader way that I never had been involved before. And in fact, I thought that they had it over Marvel for a while until the Marvel movies started coming out. And now I feel like in the last 15 years, in the wake of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, really, as much as it pains me to say, the movies have completely overshadowed the comic books as far as like where people are discovering superheroes, even kids. Like I've worked with kids as a teacher, and this will be depressing for people my age, but I'll bring up superheroes, and a lot of these kids don't even know that the characters came from comic books. They only know them from the movies. And so when I start talking about comic books, they're like, what the heck are you talking about? Like,
Wow.
like what? I've never seen a comic book in my life, but that's where we're at right now.
It's interesting.
That's
man.
wild. I remember when I was young, my grandparents, they had saved these comics that came in the Sunday papers. It was like its own little flyer. So when I was young, I had these collections of like serialized comics, and you could go from week to week and follow the story. And it's just not a way that comics are taken in anymore.
Right. The ongoing, that's the other thing too, is now even for people that do still collect and read comics, it's much more common for people to buy these trade paperbacks and the collected editions. So it's like when you have the monthly comics coming out, you have people going like, well, I'm going to wait until the whole thing gets collected and then I'm going to buy it that way. And that's like, that's such an alien thing to me. Like for me, it was always the other way around. You'd get the original issues and because they were really collectible. And then if you really liked it, then when the paperback came out, you'd buy that too on top of it, So it's definitely, there's like massive changes going on. I keep hearing rumors that, I wouldn't be surprised if in the next generation or so that comic books, especially the major comics, just go away. Warner Media has been talking because they own DC Comics. Right. It's been rumbling for a while now that they might shut down their comics division entirely, which is insane to think of, that there would be no Superman or Batman comic books. But they're looking at it and going like, why are we still doing this? Because the sales are so tiny these days compared to what they used to be.
I got so more of a current question, I guess, for anyone who are huge comic book fans that are checking this out. How do you feel about James Gunn taking over DC now? Do you think it's promising, or what do you land on that?
I try to be hopeful because I don't, and in the book, if you read my book, the book has a bias. Any book you ever read will have a bias. And I'm in there very vocally saying that DC has really dropped the ball compared to Marvel in terms of what they've done with their movie universe. It's been confusing. Yeah. It's been a mess. You got multiple versions of Batman. You got 3 different Jokers floating around. Like, what are they even doing? You got the TV continuity separate from the movie continuity. It's just all over the place. And so I'm hopeful when they say, okay, James Gunn, who I loved from Guardians of the Galaxy, you want to talk about wrestling? He took a jabroni jobber team and he made them into the main event. Every superhero movie that has been made since Guardians is trying to be like Guardians. And whoever saw that coming? And I mean, across all the different companies too. No one saw that coming. But so I'm hopeful. But I have to say, when I look at what he actually has planned, it's not that I'm going like, oh, this is going to stink. It's not something I look at where I'm like, oh, wow, okay, it's in good hands now. It's something I look at and I go, I'm going to wait and see how this turns out, because this could be great. And this could wind up being even worse than what they were doing before. So I have to wait and see. It's a real wait and see thing for me, honestly.
Yeah, I get that. I'm kind of saying I'm hopeful. Like I hope.
I'm hopeful.
Yeah. And I think it's like for DC, this would be the time, right? Because I like Marvel a lot, but there's been so much Marvel with the addition of Disney Plus in the last few years. And I don't know, for me personally, like I feel this way with wrestling for a while. Sometimes you just get burned out with stuff. And I said, okay, so this would be an ideal time for DC to, if you could put some good I did like the Peacemaker with John Cena, which I know Gunn was a part of, and I thought, oh, okay, that's good. So seeing him work on that, no one's success with Guardians, I'd like to think he could do something well. But it's still kind of, like you said, kind of a wait and see.
Yeah, and one of my biggest disappointments is Superman because it's such a shame. It's like, especially, I think of kids today that were the age I was when I discovered these characters and their perception of Superman. It must be so incredibly warped from what it's supposed to be. I mean, Zack Snyder, in my opinion, completely did not understand that character at all. And you had Henry Cavill, who was like the perfectly cast Superman, and he's stuck in these horrible movies. I'm still, I came out of Man of Steel feeling like I'd been mugged, of $15, $12, whatever it was. I feel like they just don't get the character. And because, it's such a pure, idealized character that it's like everybody's like, oh, well, we have to make him flawed and we have to make the world's going to hate him because he's an alien and he's got all this, he's got the burden of being Superman. And it's like, no, he loves being Superman. Could you imagine being Superman? It's the greatest damn thing ever to be Superman. It's not, he's not Batman. He's not Batman. How many times, he's not the Punisher. And you have to embrace that. It doesn't mean he's a cornball. It doesn't mean he's a phony. It doesn't mean he's lame. Like, all you got to do is look at the Richard Donner movies and see that it's possible of how to treat that character. And, if you look at, everybody's colored now by the Frank Miller Dark Knight Returns. Frank Miller hated Superman. It's clear to see. He made him into a government stooge. He took the whole like world's oldest Boy Scout thing so seriously. And he made him into this insufferable character where you look at him and you go like, boy, I hope Batman kicks his ass, and that's just not what the character was ever intended to be. So I'm hoping somebody comes along who gets that you could actually have a superhero that people look up to, and take it seriously at the same time.
All right. Well, before I give it back to Joe here, I want to do one more thing with a lot. And it's funny because I think we're all kind of old school pro wrestling fans. And I think all of us, there's a place for aerial wrestling, but sometimes we talk about how things have gotten so far away. Like, it's the common joke, like everybody's waiting for that dive, right? Nowadays with 10 people outside. But I wonder sometimes, loving superhero movies and do you think superhero movies, and maybe especially Marvel movies in the last 15 years, have influenced pro wrestling?
That's a really interesting idea. I think yes, to a certain degree. I think there's cross-pollination. I mean, I think movies are influenced by wrestling. I've thought that for years. When you see, I remember years ago, 20 years ago, when I went to see Freddy versus Jason. And it was one of those times where I thought like, holy cow, this movie is like a wrestling angle. And whoever wrote this, they must know wrestling. And I came to find out later that was that was true, that the screenwriters were huge wrestling fans and they were thinking of things like Jason's going to turn babyface in this movie, which he does.
Right.
And the whole thing, I mean, Freddy does an elbow drop on Jason in the movie. I mean, come on. But I mean, so I've seen stuff like that. I've seen it in the Marvel movies too, like, where I think there's some of that thinking. But I also, yes, I do see, especially recently, like if you look at the Bloodline, for example, that's something where, and I don't want to say it's just Marvel movies or superhero movies, but that's something where you can see how very consciously they are trying to take wrestling storytelling to another level. Sometimes it frustrates fans because they're used to the more traditional style of storytelling, but they're trying to make it more cinematic. If you notice, like the wrestlers are much better mic'd, so you could hear what they're saying in the ring much more than you ever used to be able to. It's like they're really trying to add these levels of detail and nuance and slow things down, which I like because I feel like, we're still recovering from that Vince Russo, like everybody's turning heel and face every week, 47 title changes a month. We're recovering from that. And I think that's a good thing. So yes, I do see a back and forth influence for sure.
Absolutely.
Nice. Well, we're going from your last book, Superheroes, a pop culture history from Ant-Man to Zorro. The link is in the description for this book, Blood and Fire, and Pro Wrestling FAQ. But those are the books you had been working on. Your newest project is still in the works, and anybody that follows you on social media knows that you're doing a book on Gorilla Monsoon. How is that process coming along?
That is going so well, and I'm so excited about it. It's called Irresistible Force: The Life and Times of Gorilla Monsoon, and I started the process in March. I'm still in that research phase, and I think that's going to probably go on even through most of the summer, at least to the middle of the summer, where I'm tracking down people for interviews. I've got so many good ones so far, and I'm like, going into the archives, doing what I did with the Sheik book, honestly, but like, because that taught me a lot of how to like streamline the process, where to look to find out information. But I mean, I've talked to, oh my God, I talked to Ross Hart about his time in Calgary. I talked to Kevin Sullivan, Tony Gurria, Irish Dave Yohannan, Mary Savoldi, Gary Capetta. I'm looking at him right now. Bill Apter, Gino Brito, Jerry Briscoe, Ken Patera, who ended his career. These kind of, and as well as people who work behind the scenes in the WWF, whose names may not be known to the general public, but people who worked around Gorilla. And I'm proud to say that, I've been in touch with his family, and it's different from the Sheik book. Gorilla's widow, Maureen, is still with us. And I have been in communication with his daughter, Valerie, and they're very friendly and very open. They have yet to officially participate in the book, and I respect their decision one way or the other, because of the whole kayfabe thing, and that's so I totally understand that, having just written the Sheik book. But there's none of when I was working on the Sheik book, it was very touchy, where I felt like the family wanted to do their own book, and I think they were very suspicious about anybody else doing something. And that has not been the case with this book, even though, I totally respect it if they don't want to sort of, let's say, like do like full interview and that kind of thing. They've been very upfront and helpful about providing information, pointing me in the direction of the right people, even hopefully in the case of photography when the time comes. So it's been a much more harmonious process than the Sheik book. But I just hope it could be as good of a book as the Sheik book, because I'm very proud of that work and I put my heart into it. So that's what I'm going to do with this one.
Yeah, I hope it comes out the same way, because like we were talking before we went on camera, the way you were able to paint the Sheik as this complete person, present his flaws in a way that wasn't judgmental, it just stated the facts. And in some cases, it was hard to look back on, especially not getting into anything deep, but just the connection with his wife and the ups and downs they had. I'm just still thinking about how I felt so bad for her at one point in the book. And then you see, but in the end, that's what true love is, staying together through hard times and being that complete partner of his. That you guys got to read the Sheik book. This is a great, not only talking about wrestling history, because you tie the Sheik's history in with what happens with the WWF and other companies, and it's just a really good historical book. And I'm sure the Gorilla book will come out much the same.
Well, part of why I wanted to do it that way, like you said, with all the history, part of it is to cover for times where the Sheik's life is so secretive that I can't know everything, and I don't know what was going on in his head, and he never gave an interview. So it's like I thought, I'm going to tell the broader picture of the whole wrestling business and his connection to it. Whereas, like, let's say for the Gorilla book, I don't know if I necessarily need to do that. A, because he was a part of a company that is still today much more widely known, and followed, because it still exists. So I don't have as much of a need to give as big of a picture. And also because there's a lot more known about Gorilla's life, about Gino's life, and he did give interviews and things in his lifetime, and he did provide information. So I can really focus much more directly on the person than I did with the last book, which I think will be a benefit of the book. And as far as, like you said, telling the truth and not being judgmental, the approach I took is, look, I'm not out to drag anyone's name through the mud. I'm not out to trash somebody. I am out to tell a truthful story. So the approach I took with Sheik was, if it's something that is directly related to the story I'm telling, and I can't tell the story without it, then it's got to go in there. There are many things that were not put in the book. again, because I'm not interested in just dancing on someone's grave, but I can't tell the story about a guy who went up and down and his company went completely under within a matter of years dramatically without explaining why that happened. It didn't just happen because of bad booking. There were a lot of bad decisions that he made in his personal life. And so I had to get into that without becoming salacious and gross and like I said, overly negative. Now with Gorilla, it's not as much of an issue because this was a guy that just everybody loved him. And I mean, you can dig and dig to try to find skeletons. The worst things you're going to find is he liked to smoke and gamble. That's about it. You're not going to really find, this was a beloved individual. And so in his case, it's more about, I think, his story being the loyalty that he had and the way that he kind of navigated the evolution of the WWF, and always found a way to belong and to contribute, and just how respected and sometimes feared he was in the business. And then at the end of his life, unfortunately, with the loss of his son, how that affected him and how he had his own kind of collapse in those last years, but for very different reasons, so it's a very different kind of story.
Yes. Now, we wanted to end this episode with a big announcement, and that is July 1st. Northeast Wrestling is coming to Veterans Park in Jewett City as part of the carnival. And at the Working Fans podcast table, Brian R. Solomon has agreed to join us, and you are going to get a chance to buy his books and meet the author himself. We are so excited to have you down there. Pro wrestling doesn't come to my hometown often. I'm going to be able to walk there. So to be able to bring in such a guest and be able to have you be able to sell your books is very exciting. So we're happy that you're going to be joining us.
Thanks for having me. I'm actually a big fan of Northeast Wrestling, again, because it's my neck of the woods too. I've been to a lot of their Bethany shows, which is like their home base, and other shows they've done. I'm really good friends with a guy named Eric Valco, who was one of their camera operators for a long time. And so we know a lot of the same people. He's actually going to be coming down with me for this show. But, so I'm glad to be a part of it. I'm glad you invited me to do it. And I'm happy to meet more readers or potential readers of the book.
Awesome.
Yes, we are. It's going to be July 1st. Before we let you go, Brian, do you have plug what you'd like to plug?
Sure. Well, can I plug my own podcast? Is that
I should have mentioned it at the top, but I was so ready to get into this discussion.
No, it's fine. I never know on someone else's podcast. But my show is called Shut Up and Wrestle, and it's part of the Arcadian Vanguard network, which is they're also the ones that carry Jim Cornette's shows and the 605 Super podcast. So it's a great platform to be on, but it's an old school vintage themed wrestling podcast, and I have different guests each week, so the conversation is so varied. It depends when you listen, what kind of show you're going to get. Like I had George Shire on recently, and we talked about the old AWA and just being a fan in the 50s, 60s, 70s. My new guest that I'm actually, as this is airing, I have Kurt Fuller, who was the star of No Holds Barred with Hulk Hogan. I just had him on. And the next episode is Abraham Josephine Reisman, who's the author of the Vince McMahon book that just came out, Ringmaster, who is a friend of mine. So I was able to book that episode and talk about that book. So like I said, it varies from week to week, and it's Shut Up and Wrestle. You can find it on all the usual platforms, but the website is suawpod.com.
And you've also got the wrestling news, if I'm correct, right?
That's right. I'm busy. The wrestling news, which is Arcadian Vanguard 2, and it's unprecedented. It sounds so simple, but it's unprecedented. We do a daily morning audio newscast of wrestling news. It's strictly news. There's no opinion. There's no clickbait. There's no like stuff that doesn't really qualify as news. Like, hey, find out what Booker T said about Sharmell. Like, that's not news. Like, we really focus on actual news that people want to hear from day to day. I write most of the script. The audio, the anchor person is Mike Sempervive, who a lot of people probably know from Wrestling Observer Radio and their shows. So he's a part of it too. We're real proud of it. It's literally every morning. You know, the wrestlingnews.com, and it's also on the Arcadian Vanguard YouTube page.
All right. Well, thank you very much, and we hope to have you on again soon, Brian. Have a good one.
All right, guys. Thank you.
All right.